Lynda Archer might live in a Gulf island in BC these days, but clearly her years growing up in Saskatchewan still linger. And while the landscape has made a big imprint, Lynda has also spent a lot of time thinking about stories from our past. Her brand new novel, the first she's written, delves into both. I've reached Lynda over the phone this morning to talk about Tears in the Grass. Hi there.
Hi, Shauna. Nice to speak with you.
Likewise, it's great to catch you over the phone today. Now, I know that your novel explores the legacy of residential schools, and I'm wondering, why was it important for you to sort of add your voice to that conversation?
I didn't set out to specifically write a book about that issue. I really was, as you mentioned in your introductory comments, had become aware of how important the land and that landscape and the prairies have always been to me. And even though I hadn't lived in Saskatchewan for a long time and in fact had gone to Ontario for school and work, I was always drawn back. I would go back to visit family, but as much as going back to visit family, I was going back to that landscape. And I would say it was a spiritual renewal for me to go back into that. And that was the actual departure of the writing, which was a recognition of that very deep spiritual place in me to then go to, well, if it has that kind of meaning for me, how must it be for those people who lived on the land and in the land and had such, as my understanding, a deep respect. And so I think all of that just came together, that it just seemed to then come that part of that history, from that unavoidable history, was the residential school issue. And I think also because I have worked as a clinical psychologist, worked with people with histories of trauma and abuse. It just kind of arose. It wasn't like I consciously set out to go to that place, but all of those things, I think, just pulled me there.
I know that 3 generations of women kind of form the heart of your story. Eleanor is 90 years old. Everything seems to begin and end with her.
Yes.
And it starts with a trauma that she experienced as a child. Can you talk a little bit about that trauma?
Well, she was, in my book, the first generation. 2 have then been taken from her family and placed in residential school. And while she was in that school, then she was sexually assaulted and raped, and subsequently had a child. That child was then taken from her, and she never got to see her for the entirety of her life. In the course of researching and talking with people and listening, I have learned so much myself, and just the horror and the depth of whether or not she had been abused in the school. It was an abuse to be just taken from her family and her culture and all that was lost to her. While the story is particularly about this Cree family, I do believe that some of the themes are very universal, and these are issues that people who have lost families and culture and languages can all relate to.
It's interesting with Eleanor because, of course, it is terrible what happened to her as a child, and the destruction of being in a residential school and what that did to her spirit was terrible. But as I read the novel, I couldn't help but find her to be actually, well, her strength is what emanated in the book. And I'm wondering how important was it for you to say, yes, this terrible thing happened, but to not turn her into a victim?
Yes, I think that's a really good point. Again, I feel like so much of this was not coming from conscious decisions, but from a very deep place of also being able to know that people have a remarkable capacity to survive and be resilient. And I actually have had a First Nations friend read the book, and one of her singular comments about it was that she so appreciated that the book pushed back against what she feels is oftentimes the stereotypical view of Aboriginal women, which is they're broken and they're drug addicted and they have all these issues. And here in my book are women who have struggles, but who are really pushing against them. And
Now, I know you talked earlier about how, in many ways, you see this as a universal story. But I'm wondering, I know that, within the First Nations community, that sometimes there is a criticism of people from outside that community who are choosing to use their voices to tell an Indigenous story. And I'm wondering if you could have a conversation with someone who took that position, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I have given this a lot of thought, and I've certainly had a lot of conversations with lots of people about this. And what would I say to that person? I'm reminded of hearing Roberta Jameson when she was the chief of Six Nations in Ontario again, and I was living there, and her comment that we just need all of the stories. And my sense is from talking to lots of different people and Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, that there is quite an array there in terms of people who clearly would say that this is appropriation of voice, and then other people who would see it as a move in terms of reconciliation. I think for people who are very adamant about that, I'm not sure that there's much that I can say that's going to shift their position other than that it's a piece of our move to reconciliation in this country. And I think certainly some of the First Nations people I've talked to would say that this isn't just an Indigenous problem, it's a Canadian problem. And so that,
which of course it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that we are all, in some way trying to address this issue.
There's so many threads in the novel that we just, of course, in this short interview don't have time to address. Right. But I'm wondering, based on sort of the sort of little frame that we have made in this conversation right now, as people are reading your novel, Tears in the Grass, I wonder, what do you hope is the big takeaway for them?
There's been a few people who've commented that as a result of reading the book, they feel like they have more appreciation of issues for First Nations people. One person has, indicated that she works in a high school and she's a librarian, and she realizes as she was growing up, she knew nothing about First Nations history. She wants her students to read this book. So I guess if people go away with some more sensitivity, appreciation, compassion, some people have already said they felt propelled by what they did read in this book, that they would go and learn more. So if people go away with an appreciation that what was done in terms of the residential schools, this is something that you don't just snap out of. And you don't just get over. And, hopefully people are beginning to appreciate the ongoingness and the generational impact of that kind of experience.
Well, Lynda, thank you for writing such a thoughtful book. I certainly found it a compelling read. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Lynda Archer is the author of Tears in the Grass, which was released just last week.